Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another bit of Total War, Warhammer 2, quick match gameplay. This time around I'm playing as the Lizardmen against the vampire counts on the map Eschen. And this is a bit of a test build, sort of, against vampires. I did decide to do a Rampage-oriented build, going with a lot of Rampage-prone dinosaurs. For my Lord, of course, I took Krokkar, who is probably one of the more competitive, if not the most competitive Lords. Of course, he has amazing melee stats, has a lot of mass, so he can kind of walk wherever the heck he wants. Has good armor at 100. Vampires obviously have huge amounts of problems with large, and that is really why I'm going, or large units, and that's really why I decided to go with this sort of list. I also did bring Swiftness of Etzel, of course, just for that extra mobility. Hand of Gods to snipe at enemy lords in the air, because I kind of expect vampires to bring some flying lords, maybe some Terrorgeist units like that. Second spawning of Zodal for that extra physical resistance. Of course, he does have a charge of Cold-Blooded, Deadly Onslaught, and all that good stuff. So Krokkar, very tanky, very powerful lord, and should perform pretty well. Now, alongside him, I did bring, on foot actually, a Skink Priest of Beast. Normally I do mount these guys up on a Stegodon, usually the normal kind, just because of it has the ballista. But this time around I did decide to go with as cheap as I could, and so he is stripped down to nothing but his Wiston's Wild form and Flock of Doom. This is mostly to disrupt enemy's squishy infantry, to deal with enemy ethereal units, because I do believe Flock of Doom does magical damage. Wiston's Wild form, of course, is just there as a cheap buff to lords if I need to. Obviously, vampire counts. Most vampire counts anti-large is not armor piercing, so it can actually be provided quite a bit of. It can actually be quite a bit of a boost. Wiston's Wild form. Now, for my front line, it is composed entirely of Sarce Warriors. Sarce Warriors, with the exception of Graveguard and Graveguard with great weapons, these guys will trade really effectively with most vampire count, most of the normal kind of skeleton-based vampire count infantry, and they'll even do okay against some of their cavalry, especially the lower-end cavalry, especially like normal Black Knights. Even Cryptars, despite not having anti-large, these guys hit very hard. So against lighter armored units, they can actually perform pretty well. They're just a very high DPS unit. Their stats are pretty bad with low melee attack and low melee defense, but especially given that they don't have shields. But it doesn't really matter in my opinion, because most undead infantry has pretty poor stats as well. Then the real, I guess, meat and potatoes of this army, or like the real damage contingent, is back here in the 2 feral Bastillodons as well as 2 feral Stegodons. And these guys obviously are rampage prone. They're fairly cheap though, at 700 for the Bastillodons, 1250 for the Stegodons. They are of course immune to fear and terror because they can do cause fear and terror on themselves. They have bonus. They both have a true bonus against infantry. Both to cause armor-piercing damage, both have extremely high armor, and both have pretty high HP. So against the vampire counts with their limited anti-large armored options, these guys could be very, very powerful. And my hope is to sort of sick them into the enemy front line and let them just rampage around. Especially if my opponent brings, say, Graveguard, these guys will help clean it up while the Sarce Warriors deal with squishier units. Then my front out here, Vanguard deployed, I do have 2 units of Chameleon Skinks. Of course, these guys do have poison, and my hope is simply to use them for debuffs, as well as to focus down, say, Crypt Horrors, which would probably be the biggest really threat to this composition. Finally, the unit of Cold One Spear Riders just kind of round out my force, giving me a bit of an anti-large presence. With some armor piercing, decent armor. These guys do definitely trade pretty efficiently for their cost. Obviously they're not going to be able to trade 1-to-1 with my opponent's Blood Knights. My opponent did bring Manfred, interestingly enough, on a Hellsteed, which actually caught me by surprise a little bit. Because obviously against Lizardmen, you can generally afford to go pretty heavy with air, because unless they bring lower high magic, they're not too. Unless they bring high magic, they don't really have too much to shut down flyers. He does have, of course, Spirit Leech, Invocation of Nehek, as well as Raise Dead, and even Curse of Years, which is actually a little bit surprising. You don't see this very often, but it's definitely a pretty powerful spell, so it could definitely cause some havoc, especially with the fairly low stats of the Lizardmen. He also, of course, does have his Sword of Unholy Power just for those power reserves, as well as Master Black Arts, which should allow him to cast a lot. 2 units of Blood Knights really kind of make up his main striking force out here on the flank. Definitely a big threat to my large units, though these guys do lack armor piercing. So even with their fairly massive anti-large bonus, so I do believe 22, these guys will definitely struggle to kind of put down some of these large units like feral Bastillodons or feral Stegodons in a timely manner. Much less Krokkar, who fights back and can be really, really mean. For his front line, my opponent does have a whole bunch of Skeleton Spearmen, backed up by a whole bunch of Crypt Ghouls. A bit of an interesting combo, for sure. Though, given once again, the tendency to bring a lot of large with Lizardmen, this could definitely be a pretty useful combination, just to kind of slow down and beat up on large units in a pretty cost-efficient manner. Behind that, 2 units of Cryptars. Of course, these guys do cause poison. They do hit pretty hard. They have armor piercing. They have a lot of mass, so they can stop units from charging through. And they're just pretty powerful in general. Finally, unit of Karen Wraiths. And once again, these guys are not the worst of picks for against Lizardmen. Because Lizardmen have pretty low stats, so these guys low melee attack and melee defense won't be too much of a problem. Then they do cause armor piercing, which is good against the armored units. And their physical resistance will mean that most of my troops don't really do very much damage to them. As you can see immediately, my opponent was not braced with the skeleton spears, and I'm immediately just charging in, throwing my feral stegodons into the fray. And just trying to crush these skeleton spears and all those units as quickly as I can. You can see I do get a few volleys off with my poison blow darts off into these crypt ghouls, but then I'm surely going to be forced to flee by the Karen Wraiths. Unfortunately for the Karen Wraiths, they are, I do believe, just about the same speed as Chameleon Skinks, so they won't really be able to escape. Or won't really be able to catch them, especially once these guys start shooting. Over here you can see the 2 Blood Knights have charged into the Source Warriors, and they're actually crushing them pretty quickly. But I do have Krokgar there, as well as the Cold One Spear Riders, who are unfortunately being debuffed by the Curse of Years, and that's definitely giving them a bit of a rough time. Krokgar, though, as you can see, is definitely dishing out a lot of hurt. He's jumping around like a maniac and doing quite a bit of damage. Fortunately, these Source Warriors are just going to have a really bad day of this, and they're going to rout off pretty shortly. Over here in the front line, things are going pretty well. You can see a lot of these units are already wavering. Obviously, the Cryptars are doing pretty well against the Bastildons, but the rest of these units are definitely struggling to make much of an impact on the super heavily armored rampaging mob of monsters. You can see a Flock of Doom is of Overcast. I've dropped it here on all these squishy units, just trying to melt them down. I'll ensure that this frontline fight goes down a little faster, so that I can then reposition these units and hopefully deal with these my enemy's cavalry. Unfortunately, my opponent has dropped some zombies, slowing me down, and one of my units, Chameleon Skinks, has actually been terrified off, which I'm not entirely sure what's terrifying them off, because obviously Blood Knights do not cause terror, and neither does Manfred. It might be that they're close enough to the Karen Wraiths for their terror to kick in. As you can see, though, Krokgar is jumping around. He's chasing these Blood Knights. Krokgar definitely is one of the lords where, despite being large, he's actually pretty brutal against some of the cavalry units. You can see I do drop an Overcast Flock of Doom on these Karen Wraiths, and you can see he's doing quite a bit of work to him. They're nothing too impressive. Some of these Cold One Knights, though, are getting snagged, and they're definitely struggling to trade with the Blood Knights, who will crush them pretty handily in 1-to-1, and are now crushing them even more handily because they're being hit by Invocation of the Heck. Now, Krokgar, despite being a large target and having good but not amazing armor values, is actually going to be able to trade pretty effectively with Blood Knights, and he's going to be able to kind of stomp them pretty heavily. You can see over here, Source Warriors are getting bogged down and blocked by zombies, which is a bit of a problem and definitely a bit of a which is definitely just a bit of a problem for me. Over here, though, the frontline fight is going very, very well for me. Obviously, my opponent's troops cannot do all that much against these Stegodons and the Source Warriors and all that. Though over here on the left, it isn't going quite as well because the Cryptars are here, and they're obviously then the smackdown on some of these units who lack anti-large and have fairly low melee stats and are being poisoned and all that. The Cold One Riders are being forced to rout off. You can see I'm trying to pepper my opponent down with some Chameleon Skinks. And Krokgar is now just kind of sliding out with Manfred. And Krokgar is obviously no pushover. With the help of Wiston's Wild Form, he's hitting like an absolute truck. It's with 709 weapon strength, armor piercing, and anti-large. And so poor Manfred is definitely having a bad day. But you can see my Chameleon Skinks are having an even worse day and are getting ridden down by these filthy Blood Knights and just having a very bad time of it. So I do almost get Manfred, but Manfred does manage to escape, runs away, and takes into the air despite swiftness. He's still being popped, which should technically make Krokgar a lot faster. He's at over 102 speed. In the meantime, though, this right flank has finally almost been mopped up. Once these crypt ghouls die, which they're already crumbling, so that shouldn't take too long, I'll be able to commit everything into this central pocket and kind of try to wipe things out there. Unfortunately, the Karen Wraiths are coming back, but my opponent, I do think, makes made a little bit of a mistake here, chasing after these Chameleon Skinks, who obviously are not much of a threat to Blood Knights, but so these 2 Blood Knights are being drawn away, shutting down units that have actually already routed off. In the meantime, those Source Warriors are pushing in. You can see the Karen Wraiths over here do push into the Source Warriors again, and as well as the Feral Stegodon, which has almost finished off these Crypt Ghouls. Over here, this Feral Bastildon is laying down the hurt on these Skeleton Spears, who are just having a really bad time of it. As this other unit of Skeleton Spears. This Stegodon actually routed off, but it's now coming back. Unfortunately at this point I'm basically out of Winds of Magic, so I'm using my spellcaster in melee, and just hoping to kind of crumble these units. Krokgar is still at over 4,000 HP, and just having a really good time of it. The Cold Ones are almost in there. They are obviously very low HP, but they do have a bonus against large. They have armor piercing, so my hope is that they can kind of help wipe out these Cryptars fairly quickly. It's important to keep in mind with Krokgar that, for example, he can actually outtrade Demigryphs with halberds in a straight-up fight. So he's definitely one of the best anti-large lords in the game as far as just dealing with enemy large units, as well as defending himself against enemy large unit goon squads. Over here, unfortunately, my chameleon skinks, which I did push a little too far forward, do get caught once by the blood knights, and they're getting annihilated. But this feral stegodon, because it's armor, it's going to be pretty tanky, and it's going to be able to kind of survive there. These zombies are not having the best time of it. Neither are the Karen wraiths. Karen wraiths, one of the big problems with ethereal units is that once their leadership drops and they start crumbling, these guys will crumble very, very quickly, even if they're not disintegrating, just because their overall HP is just so very, very low. Over here, these skeleton spears are basically out of it. Krokar is just picking off these last few crypt horrors, and with the help of some of these Sarge warriors and Skink Priest. And my opponent, once again, is kind of leaving his Blood Knights to chase after Chameleon Skinks, which in my opinion is once again a little bit of a waste. This Feral Stegodon over here, it's obviously has very poor melee stats, so it will struggle a bit against the Blood Knights. It's not going to be able to win against them by any means, but it's holding its own. It's surviving. Krokar does turn around now, trying to help this flank a little bit, going after these Blood Knights, jumping all over him, and doing quite a bit of hurt, but he himself is taking quite a bit of damage in return. You can see he took off about 5 models down on those Blood Knights, so he definitely hits like a truck. He's definitely a pretty brutal opponent to go up against, and definitely no laughing matter. Unfortunately for my opponent, most of his units have kind of fallen apart. You can see, unfortunately, despite rampaging, these guys aren't actually charging after a near unit. They're just kind of sitting around there being sad. So this definitely means that at this point, Krokar's doing most of the heavy lifting, with the help of a handful of these rampaging units that have decided to come back, as well as some of the units that I do control. These Blood Knights over here have just gotten rear charge. Krokar is trying to disentangle himself. The charge bonuses are actually not that great on the Bastillodons, or actually the Stegodon has a really high charge bonus, so I'm wrong there. I was about to say it doesn't have a good charge bonus either, but it doesn't have a good speed, but it does have a good charge bonus. And it's able to get in there and do some pretty nasty damage against these Blood Knights. And you can see at this point, Manfred is almost at his healing cap. He's down on the ground, and he's getting just torn apart. My Cold One Riders have actually come back, and at this point his army does disintegrate, and that's actually going to be a game. At this point it's just zombie cleanup for a few seconds, but my opponent does decide to GG out. So very tight match. I definitely think that this is, against Vampire Count, I don't think this is that bad of a composition. Something I would perhaps change is trying to squeeze in one extra unit of Cold One Riders with spears. I'm not entirely sure what I'd have to sacrifice for that. Perhaps one unit of Saurish warriors and downgrading the Chameleon Skink, something like that. But this, I think, is definitely a fairly effective kind of composition. You do have your anti-large in there between Krokar and the Cold One Spear Riders, and some help from the Chameleon Skinks. You do have your kind of units to crush enemy squishy infantry with all the Sarge warriors, and then you have units like the Bastillodons and Stegodons to crush enemy heavy infantry. So, all in all, I think it's a pretty well-rounded build against most of what Vampire Counts can bring against the Dinos. As you can see, the Sarge warriors had an absolute field day, as did the Stegodons. One of the things that doesn't, you can only field 2 Stegodons, so I couldn't actually cram in an additional one, which a third Stegodon would probably be more useful than the 2 Feral Bastillodons. But obviously, the Stegodon is just not, you can't field 3, so that's why I decided to throw in Feral Bastillodons. Perhaps I would have been better off dropping Sarge warriors, replacing these 2 Bastillodons with a Bastillodon with a Revivification Crystal, and then trying to squeeze in a Cold One or Spear Riders that way. So, but regardless, I do think this is a pretty powerful composition. This is, I do think, one of the few matchups where Rampage is not too much of a problem, because Vampires don't really have a backline, so you don't really have to tell your units to prioritize certain troops after the main fight has begun, usually. So it's not too much of a problem here. Krokar, definitely a very solid lord. He's definitely one of those guys who can very hard to crush. I do. There's in a 1-to-1, he's one of, if not the most powerful lords in the game, and even against units designed to hunt large targets like Blood Knights, obviously Terrorgeist, all that sort of stuff, he will still trade very, very effectively. So definitely don't underestimate Krokar. He's definitely very, very powerful. But regardless, good game to my opponent, Confucius. As you can see, some of his Blood Knights performed very well. Obviously, and actually, as you can see, some of the Crypticals did fairly well for themselves as well. Definitely, I don't think this is that bad of a composition against Vampire Counts, or against Dinos, against Lizardmen. Definitely caught me by surprise a little bit with how much squishy infantry he brought, though it does, I think, make some sense against with how much poison you get, and that definitely cuts into the DPS of the Sarge warriors. So, yep, good game to my opponent. I do hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below for additional content. As usual, guys, if you have any comments, criticism, any questions about Total War or anything like that, be sure to post them down in the comments, and I'll respond as soon as I can. As usual, guys, I do appreciate you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.